Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today, we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. After the wedding, life finally gave Jack and Tu Tien something they had once been afraid to even dream about for too long. Peace. Not perfect peace. Not a life without pressure or responsibility, but a real and steady kind of happiness that settled into their home and stayed. The house that had once opened with tears, blessings, and promises now carried the quiet rhythm of family life. Morning light came through the window's jacket carefully chosen. Their little boy's laughter filled the rooms. Even the smallest, most ordinary moments began to feel precious, because both of them knew exactly how much had once been at risk. For the first time in a very long while, they were not trying to survive, they were living. Jack loved married life more deeply than he expected to admit, even to himself. There was something about coming home and seeing Tu Tien moving through the kitchen, hearing their son make small, excited sounds the moment he heard his father's footsteps, and sitting down to a meal in a home built by love and sacrifice that softened him in a way business never could. He had been through scandal, investigation, prison, public humiliation, and fear. He had seen his name dragged through mud and brought back only by truth and endurance. And because of that, every ordinary moment in his family life now felt extraordinary. Tu Tien noticed it too. Some nights, after putting their son to sleep, she would sit beside Jack and just watch him for a moment. He was still the same man in many ways, steady, focused, serious when work demanded it. But there was a warmth in him that had grown stronger after all their suffering. He laughed more easily now. He listened more carefully. He no longer treated peace like something he could take for granted. One evening, while their little boy was asleep in Jack's arms, after refusing to settle for anyone else, Tu Tien smiled and said softly, "You know, if someone saw you now, they would never believe you were once the man frightening entire construction teams on site." Jack glanced at her and then at the sleeping child in his arms. "I still frighten people." Tu Tien laughed quietly. "Maybe at the office, not here." Jack looked back down at his son and adjusted the blanket over him with ridiculous care. "That's because here, I know what matters." That truth shaped everything that came after. At the same time, outside the walls of their home, Jack's company was changing at a speed that surprised even those who believed in him most. The major projects he had completed after clearing his name did not just stabilize the company, they transformed it. One successful partnership led to another, and then another. Large corporations that once watched from a distance now actively sought him out. Investors who had once hesitated now wanted meetings. Development firms, industrial groups, and infrastructure partners all began approaching Jack's company with serious proposals. At first, it looked like a period of strong recovery. Then it became something bigger than that. The company expanded rapidly. New divisions were formed, offices grew busier, teams multiplied. Projects increased in both scale and value. The firm that had once fought just to survive was now being spoken of as one of the fastest rising names in the construction field. Before long, people stopped referring to it as a recovering company. They started calling it a group. Then, little by little, a corporation. And finally, the word many had once thought impossible. Ly became attached to Jack's name, a conglomerate. Jack's business was no longer just one company taking contracts. It had become a major presence. That rise changed their life in visible ways. The house felt more secure. Their son lacked for nothing. Tu Tien no longer had to think twice before buying what the family needed. Jack was able to support his mother comfortably, strengthen his business structure, and build the kind of future he had once feared he would never have the chance to touch. But success of that size never comes quietly. The higher Jack rose, the more people watched him, and not all of them watched with respect. At first, the signs were small, easy to dismiss. A rumor here, a misleading comment there. Competitors quietly suggesting that Jack's rise had been too fast to be trustworthy. Anonymous voices in industry circles asking how someone with a scandal once attached to his name could now be signing so many valuable contracts. Small attempts to cast doubt without saying anything directly enough to be challenged. Jack noticed it. Of course he did, but he did not react immediately. He had learned long ago that success attracts noise, and not every noise deserves a response. For a while, he kept his focus on the work itself. Quality, discipline, transparency, delivery. Those things had rebuilt his name once already. He believed they would protect it again. And for some time that worked, but envy rarely stays passive. As the company grew larger, the people who disliked Jack's success became bolder. One afternoon, after a long meeting with two senior managers, Jack sat alone in his office reading through a report from one of the newer departments. The numbers looked slightly off, not catastrophically, just enough to bother him. A supplier timeline did not align neatly with the procurement record. A subcontractor request had been processed faster than it should have. It was not proof of anything yet, but the inconsistency pricked his instincts immediately. His face changed. Years ago, he might have overlooked it while handling 10 other urgent matters. Now, he did not. He called in one of his most trusted internal auditors and asked for a quiet review. "Don't make noise yet," Jack said. "Just check everything." The auditor nodded and left. That evening, when Jack came home, Tu Tien noticed a change in him before he even spoke. It was not the desperate tension she remembered from the darkest days, but it was enough. "What happened?" she asked while setting out the evening meal. Jack loosened his tie and sat down more slowly than usual. Their son, who had been playing nearby, immediately toddled over to his father and held up a toy with complete seriousness, as if trying to fix the mood through simple generosity. Jack took it, smiled faintly, and set it on the table before looking at Tu Tien. "Maybe nothing," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "That means definitely something." Jack let out a short breath that almost became a laugh. "There are a few irregularities in one department. I've asked for a quiet review." Tu Tien watched him carefully. "Do you think it's serious?" "I don't know yet." That answer did not satisfy her, but she knew him well enough to understand that when Jack said he did not know yet, it meant he was already looking deeper than he wanted to show. Over the next several days, the small irregularities became harder to dismiss. A procurement note had been altered after approval. A supplier reference turned out to connect indirectly to a competitor-linked intermediary. An internal signature had been submitted from an account that did not fully match the actual approval chain. Then another issue surfaced in a separate division. Theo. Individually, each problem was manageable. Together, they suggested something far more dangerous. Someone was not merely making careless mistakes. Someone was testing the company from the inside. One evening, long after most staff had gone home, Jack remained in the office with several documents spread across his desk. The auditor sat across from him, tense but controlled. "This doesn't look random anymore," the auditor said quietly. Jack did not answer immediately, because he agreed. He picked up one of the files and studied it again. The methods were subtle, not reckless enough to attract attention instantly, not obvious enough to expose the person behind them too quickly. Whoever was doing this understood how companies worked, how approvals move, and how to create confusion without immediate collapse, which made it more dangerous. Jack set the file down slowly. "Someone's probing for weakness," he said. The auditor nodded. "Or laying the groundwork for something bigger." That sentence stayed in the room like a shadow. When Jack returned home that night, Tu Tien was already sitting with their son asleep beside her. She looked up the moment he entered, and in one glance, she understood that whatever had started as a small concern was no longer small. Jack sat down across from her and for a second said nothing. Tu Tien's voice was quiet when she finally asked, "It's worse than you first thought, isn't it?" Jack looked at her and nodded once. "There's enough now to say this clearly," he said. "Someone is trying to damage the company." Tu Tien's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the blanket near their son. From outside, as Jack's eyes darkened. Maybe, but they're using something or someone inside. The room went silent, because both of them knew exactly what those kinds of words could lead to. They had lived through hidden sabotage before. They had lived through betrayal dressed as trust. They had lived through the kind of damage one wrong person could do when allowed too close to the foundation of everything. Tu Tien looked toward their sleeping child and then back at Jack. In the quiet of that home they had worked so hard to build, with happiness finally beginning to feel real and stable, one difficult question slowly returned between them. Now that Jack's company had become powerful enough to attract envy from dangerous people, was another storm already beginning to form behind the walls of their success? That question did not leave either of them after that night. For Jack, it was not only the possibility of financial loss that troubled him. Money could be rebuilt. Contracts could be replaced. Even reputation, painful as it was to lose, could sometimes be repaired with time and truth. He knew that better than most. What followed him now was something deeper. He had already seen what hidden sabotage could do once before. He had already watched betrayal move through paperwork, approvals, and trust until it became disaster. And because of that, the moment he felt even the faintest sign that someone might be trying to damage his company from inside, every instinct in him sharpened. This time, he would not be slow. The next morning, he went into the office earlier than usual and called in only a handful of people he trusted fully. No broad meetings, no visible panic, no careless accusations. He had learned too much to move blindly. He instructed the internal audit team to expand the review quietly across multiple departments. Procurement, legal approvals, vendor verification, subcontractor channels, payment routing, document access logs, everything. He also brought in an outside compliance consultant under the official reason of system strengthening, so no one would immediately suspect the real purpose. If someone was trying to damage the company, Jack wanted them to believe they still had room to move. At home, Tu Tien could feel the shift in him immediately. He was still warm with their son, still present at meals, still gentle with her. But behind that, there was another layer again, the one she had seen during the hardest chapters of their life. Not fear exactly. Focus. A quiet intensity that meant his mind was working even when he appeared still. One evening, while their little boy was trying to stack cups and failing happily, Tu Tien looked over at Jack and asked, "Have you found anything new?" Jack, who had been half watching the child and half reading something on his phone, lifted his eyes slowly. "Yes," he said. That one word was enough to make her sit straighter. "What kind of thing?" Jack set the phone down and leaned back. "There are patterns now, repeated ones. Certain approval routes are being manipulated. A few supplier introductions were made through shell intermediaries. Some documentation was altered after internal review." Tu Tien's face changed. "That's not carelessness." "No," Jack said quietly. "It isn't." For a moment, the only sound in the room was their son knocking one cup into another and laughing at the noise. Tu Tien lowered her voice instinctively. "Do you know who it is?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet, but I know this much: whoever is behind it understands the company well. They know how to stay just below the surface." That was what chilled her most, because sabotage from outside was dangerous. But sabotage guided by someone who understood the inside was worse. Over the following week, more details came in. A procurement officer had approved a vendor file that should never have passed final review. A logistics coordinator had received unofficial instructions from a private email not tied to the company domain. A vendor's listed ownership led, through several layers, to a business linked to one of Jack's competitors. Then, more troubling still, the audit team found evidence that certain delays had been engineered intentionally, not enough to stop operations, just enough to make performance appear unstable in reports sent to key partners. It was clever. Whoever planned it knew that major corporations do not walk away at the first small problem, but they do begin to lose confidence when a series of minor issues starts forming a pattern. Someone was trying to poison trust before causing visible collapse. One afternoon, Jack sat with the outside consultant, the internal auditor, and two of his oldest managers in a closed-door meeting. No one spoke casually. The files on the table were too serious now. One of the managers finally said, "This is coordinated." Jack nodded once. The consultant added, "And likely strategic. It looks less like theft for profit alone and more like interference aimed at weakening the company in front of major partners." Jack's jaw tightened, because that matched what his instincts had already been telling him. This was not someone trying to steal a little money and disappear. This was someone trying to wound the company itself. That evening, Jack did not hide the truth from Tu Tien. He found her in the courtyard just after sunset, gently rocking their son, who was sleepy and warm against her shoulder. The soft evening light made the whole scene look peaceful, almost untouched by the tension building elsewhere. Jack stood still for a second before joining her. Tu Tien looks at his face and asks quietly, "It's serious now, isn't it?" Jack sat down beside her. "Yes." She let out a slow breath. "Tell me." So he did. Not every legal detail, not every technical layer, but enough. Enough for her to understand that this was no longer a concern to monitor. It was a deliberate attempt to damage the company from within and from outside at the same time. Tu Tien listened carefully, her hand moving absently over their son's back. When Jack finished, she was quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you think it's someone trying to compete with you, or someone trying to compete with you, or someone trying to take revenge?" Jack looked out into the darkening yard. Maybe both. That answer stayed between them, because Jack's success had not only attracted admiration, it had also attracted resentment in an industry built on large money, large contracts, and fragile trust. Permit could become dangerous very quickly. The next real breakthrough came unexpectedly. A mid-level employee from the procurement division asked, through a third person, to speak privately with Jack. He was nervous enough that Jack agreed immediately and arranged the meeting away from the main office. The man arrived pale and clearly frightened. At first, he spoke in circles, as though trying to decide whether truth would save him or destroy him. But eventually, the pressure inside him broke. He admitted that he had been approached weeks earlier by someone claiming to represent an external business interest. At first, it sounded harmless, small favors, minor routing changes, harmless-looking delays. He had been told that nothing major would happen, that it was only about shifting certain contracts and weakening internal reporting in order to create negotiation advantages for another company. When Jack asked which company, the man hesitated. That hesitation told him enough before the answer even came. It was one of the fastest-growing rival firms in the region, a firm that had tried and failed to win two of the same major contracts Jack's company had secured. The room went cold. The employee insisted he had not understood how far the scheme would go. He claimed he had stopped cooperating once the manipulation grew more serious, but by then, damage had already been done. Jack listened without interrupting. His face stayed calm, but inside, anger moved through him with a force he had not felt in a long time. Not wild anger, focused anger. Because someone had looked at the life he had rebuilt, the company he had fought to clean and strengthen, the stability he had earned for his family, and decided to attack it in secret. When Jack brought the information back to his legal team and compliance advisors, everything accelerated. Internal evidence was preserved, digital access was locked down, the compromised employee was suspended under monitored conditions, external counsel prepared for formal action. Quiet notifications were sent to the key corporate partners most likely to be affected, not as confessions, but as proactive protection. That move mattered a lot, because Jack had learned from the past that silence, when problems are already inside the walls, only helps the wrong people. This time he acted before the damage could define the story. The partners responded better than expected, not with panic, with respect, because Jack did what many leaders failed to do. He identified the threat, contained it early, and communicated before trust was fully broken. Several of the major groups told him directly that his transparency was the reason they would continue standing with him. For the first time since this new threat began, Jack felt the ground steady slightly beneath his feet. But that did not mean the danger was over, because once people who work in the dark realize they're being exposed, they do not always step back quietly. One night, after a long meeting with lawyers and senior staff, Jack returned home later than he wanted. Tu Tien was still awake, waiting in the sitting room while their son slept nearby. The moment he walked in, she stood. "You're late." "I know." He sounded tired enough that she did not repeat it. Instead, she stepped closer and searched his face. "What happened?" Jack loosened his collar slowly. "We found the source." Tu Tien's heart tightened. And now they know we found it." The room went still, because both of them understood exactly what that might mean. Exposure could stop sabotage, or it could trigger escalation. Tu Tien looked toward the room where their son was sleeping, then back at Jack. In the quiet of the house they had filled with love, one more difficult question rose between them. Now that Jack had uncovered the people trying to destroy his company, would the danger end there, or had he just stepped into the beginning of a much bigger battle?